My name is John Parnell. On behalf of the UNCP School of Business, welcome to today's speaker presentation. Students, be sure to sign in one of the student sign-in sheets on the way in. You'll see those at the door so we can have a record of your attendance. This event has been made possible by the support of the Manhattan Institute, and we appreciate their support for our speaker program and for defending the ideas of markets. Nicole Gelinas is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor of City Journal and a columnist at the New York Post. She writes on urban economics and finance. Gelinas is a CFA charter holder and the author of After the Fall, Saving Capitalism from Wall Street and Washington. Gelinas has published analysis and opinion pieces in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, and other publications. Before coming to the City Journal, she was a business journalist for Thomson Financial, where she covered the international syndicated loan and private debt markets. Gelinas holds a BA in English Literature from Tulane University. Nicole Gelinas' presentation will be followed by a time for Q&A and a well-stocked reception behind us. Please submit your questions electronically at any time during the presentation by logging into Slido. You'll see several different designations on the wall here with the code you need. It's event code 6095. So you can provide your questions there and vote for other questions you like. There will also be some live questions mixed in as well, so take your choice on those. Please join me in welcoming Nicole Gelinas to UNCP.
Good afternoon. Thank you, John. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm here today to talk about President Trump's infrastructure plan. Will the president's plan fix the country's infrastructure crisis? And if not, why not? Now, in case you have better things to do and you need to leave right now, I'll give you the answer right now. You don't have to wait till the end. The answer is no. Trump's infrastructure plan will not fix the country's infrastructure crisis. But I do hope you will stay, because I think the answers of how and why it won't fix our infrastructure issues are important, and not just for the infrastructure world. First, it's an illustration of numbers and how numbers work and how numbers don't work, that a headline number can be misleading. Second, it's to talk about the role of the government versus the role of the private sector, that both government and the private sector have important roles to play in a free market system, but that those roles are very different, and trying to make the government do something the private sector to do, or trying to make the private sector do something that the government should do, is not a good idea, and in the end, it hurts free market capitalism. And finally, it's to talk about the interplay between the federal budget and state and local budgets. People tend to think only about the federal budget, that federal spending is what sets the tone of the country, but in fact, state and local governments are the primary actors on infrastructure. And in case you're still bored by infrastructure, despite my attempts to make it interesting, I'll try to save a few minutes at the end to talk about the sharing economy, driverless cars, and whether that phenomenon will help to fix our infrastructure crisis as well. So first of all, Trump's infrastructure plan, many of you may have seen it. The president rolled out this plan just a couple of weeks ago. And you may have remembered from the campaign, before he was elected president, Trump said that he wanted to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure over a decade. And just last June, the president said that this would be sufficient to, quote, build new roads, bridges, tunnels, airports, and railways gleaming across our very, very beautiful land. In the proposal that the president or the White House put out this month, this amount of money was increased from $1 trillion to at least, and that's another quote from the report, $1.5 trillion. So $1.5 trillion, even in the United States of America, sounds like a lot of money. You know, the old joke used to be $1 million here, $1 million there, you're looking at real money. Today, perhaps it's $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there, you're looking at real money because of inflation and the growth in the federal budget and so forth. But $1.5 trillion broken down into its context is not a lot of money for infrastructure. And why is that? First of all, the president's plan is over a decade. So that would be $150 billion a year. Again, sounds like a big number. But consider that the defense budget for this year is $692 billion. Now, I like defense. I realize that defense is expensive and important, but defense is essentially the same as infrastructure. It is a lot of money spent on big, expensive things and also on people. The defense budget is made up of things and people, so is the infrastructure budget. These things are not very complicated. You're spending this money buying materials and paying people to build things out of these materials. So 150 billion versus 692 billion, a big difference to see how modest in context that the president's proposal is. And consider also that the federal government under former President Obama is already spending about $100 billion a year on infrastructure. The year before he left office, Obama signed a bill from Congress to a 5-year infrastructure bill. That law already allocates $100 billion a year on national infrastructure, even if Trump does nothing. So Trump's proposal would more than double this, but it is not something that comes out of nowhere. And considering the infrastructure deficits that we have, that would, it wouldn't do what Trump said he wanted to do during the campaign and throughout the past year in building world-class infrastructure, high-speed rail, and so forth to rival China. The president has often mentioned infrastructure in the rest of the world as much better than ours. And so we're talking about increasing what we're already doing, not making a radical difference in our priorities. Now, we've already taken down this $1.5 trillion number, so it seems more modest. But if you read the fine print of the president's plan, the president doesn't want to spend he doesn't want to spend $1.5 trillion of federal money on infrastructure over a decade. He only wants to spend $200 billion of new federal money. The rest of the money, the other $1.3 trillion, he says would come from the private sector and from state and local governments. In other words, this $200 billion would be seed money to leverage money from other sources, the private sector and lower levels of government. So already we have a $1.5 trillion big scale investment that's already down to $200 billion over 10 years. That's only $20 billion a year, which is only 20% more than what we're already spending. So this is already much less impressive than it may have sounded on the campaign trail and in some of the more superficial news reports about the infrastructure plan. And just consider, again in context, $20 billion of new money a year, spread over 50 states. That's only $400 million a year for each state. And that actually overstates the case because the Trump administration wants to spend 25% just on rural areas. Rural areas only have 19% of the population, so they're getting more than 30% more than their population would denote their fair share. And again, to again put it in context, states are expecting much more from the federal government. You look just at New York and New Jersey, for example, they need to build a $20 billion tunnel under the Hudson River to replace an aging tunnel that moves 200,000 people every day to commute across the river to their jobs. And so, given that context, that project has to happen in the next decade. Those two states are expecting at least half of the money for that project from the federal government. That's $10 billion by itself, even if they don't build any other infrastructure, which they want to do. So this brings us to point number 2. Remember, the other $1.3 trillion is supposed to be split between the private sector and state and local governments. Getting a good proportion of this money from the private sector is problematic, and it showcases a dangerous confusion about what the private sector does and doesn't do. The private sector does a lot of things well, including a lot of our existing infrastructure. If you think about what is infrastructure, people think of roads, bridges, highways, passenger rail systems, ports, broadband networks, water networks, sewer networks, and airports, pipelines. The private sector does a lot of this already. If you have a broadband connection at home, you obviously have water and sewer, electric companies. These are generally private. I mean, there are some exceptions in the country, but for the most part, you pay a private company to provide you with electricity. You pay a private company to provide you with broadband. You pay a private company to bring oil and gas into your home. That infrastructure spending happens without much need of interference from any level of government, apart from permitting, taxation, and so forth, for a simple reason: it pays for itself. Generating electricity is a profitable business. Generating and distributing oil and gas is a profitable business. Broadband, with the exception of some rural areas, is a profitable business. And so these areas of the infrastructure world, they don't need very much, if any, government subsidy or much government direction or supervision. This happens by itself, no matter who is the president or who controls Congress. And again, an illustration from New York, just because that's where I am most of the time. The state of New York is already building LaGuardia Airport, a $4 billion project, without need from any more money from the federal government. Why is that? It's not because the state is putting $4 billion into the airport. It's because the airlines are paying for it. You are paying for it when you fly. You pay an extra fee to rebuild the airport. Really, no government involvement needed other than the state having to be a sort of liaison between the airlines and the airport and put together the contracts. So all of that infrastructure pays for itself. It's doing fine. What is the problem with the rest of the infrastructure? It doesn't pay for itself. If we look at our infrastructure that's considered crumbling, in bad shape, it's infrastructure that does not generate user fees to pay for itself. So it's your local roads, it's highways that don't have tolls on them, which is most highways. It's subway systems where people pay a fee, but it is not high enough to cover the high capital cost of a passenger rail system. It's flood protection, dams, levees, and so forth, because you can't, it's impossible to figure out exactly who is benefiting from a flood control system and charge that person a fee. The benefits are spread over a broad area compared to me getting electricity in my house and paying for that electricity. So when Trump talks about attracting private capital to infrastructure, to attract private capital to this type of infrastructure would really require a big change in how we think about infrastructure. For example, we certainly have the technology to toll major highways. So we could take I-95 up and down North and South Carolina, I-40 going to the west, and charge a toll based on mileage and weight of the vehicle. This, in a private sector entity, could collect the toll money, and in return for that money and a profit, a monopoly regulated profit most likely because there's no competition, the company could maintain, build, expand possibly the highways. But people are not used to paying tolls, and they'd probably be quite high. I mean, you're looking, if you were to drive from here to one of the two airports, it'd probably be well above $20 for this 100-mile trip. We haven't heard any of that type of rhetoric from the president, that we want to suddenly switch to a user-pay system for much more of our infrastructure. If we did that for something like toll roads, there's nothing economically wrong with that, but there are questions about, are you contributing to inequities by making some people pay, but not all of the people who benefit from the road. If I own a business that benefits from a lot of traffic along this highway, should not I pay for some of the upkeep of the road through my property taxes, income taxes, rather than just the people who come to my business paying a toll to come to this business? So a lot of questions about part of infrastructure that private capital could fund, and really no answers on infrastructure that it's very difficult to see how private capital would fund. The toll road is one thing, but you're never going to get private investors to build and keep up a dam and try to go around and levy fees on all of the people in the area who might benefit from that dam. It's just maybe not impossible, but very difficult. So the third point is, after the federal government and after private industry, state and local governments are supposed to pay the remainder of this $1.5 trillion in infrastructure. And having state and local government pay for infrastructure doesn't represent a big difference in how we do things. State and local government already pay 3 out of every $4 that the country spends on infrastructure. I mentioned that the U.S. is spending $100 billion on infrastructure every year. State and local governments pay another $300 billion. And this is everything from local potholes to local water systems. I mean, things that the federal government really doesn't need to get involved in. The problem, though, in asking state and local government to step up for bigger scale mega projects like the tunnel underneath the Hudson River, or like better high-speed rail across the eastern seaboard, is that state and local governments are not in a position to spend more money on anything. They are facing a tsunami of retirement obligations for their own public sector workers. If you look at the numbers for state and local deficits in pension and healthcare systems for their own government workers and retirees, they already have, as of 2015, which is the last full year that numbers are available for, they're looking at a $1.1 trillion deficit. You look at the healthcare deficit they have for retirement healthcare benefits, you're looking at a $650 million or billion-dollar deficit. So already, the deficits that state and local governments face for their own employees' retirements, they dwarf any attempt by the federal government to spend more money on infrastructure. And people tend to think of this as a blue state problem, that states like Illinois, New Jersey, they didn't fund their pension and health care benefits. And that's absolutely true. If you look at the 4 worst funded states, you have Illinois, New Jersey, Kentucky, and but also you also have South Carolina, which has only funded 58% of its pension benefits. Kentucky, I mentioned, is one of the 4 worst. They've only funded 38% of their pension obligations. North Carolina is actually doing very well. They're 95% funded on their pensions. But if you look at the national picture, it is very difficult to ask state and local governments to step up for massive new infrastructure investment in order for them to receive this new federal money when they are looking at these obligations. Even a mild recession would cause a state like New Jersey to have to triple its annual $2 billion pension cost, and they don't have a prayer in the world of funding something like the Hudson River Tunnel without much more federal help than the Trump administration is contemplating. So it's very difficult to pursue a national infrastructure reinvestment without addressing these retirement gaps at the state and local level. Now, we certainly shouldn't have a bailout of these state and local costs, but there should be more awareness of them, and that there's a disconnect in Washington asking the states to pay more for infrastructure when they're already struggling with these long-term deficits. And the infrastructure proposal should really have a component where states that reduce these pension and healthcare liabilities by changing their retirement plans for newer workers should get some kind of credit from the federal government for making that cut, sort of a matching program where if states cut back on these obligations, therefore having more money for infrastructure, Washington would step up and match whatever that cut in retirement benefits for that state was. You know, not fully match, but 25%, 10%. That even reducing these pension and healthcare deficits by 25% and matching that with a federal dollar, this by itself would double the Trump infrastructure plan. So I'll conclude in talking about the Trump plan by mentioning some of the good things about the Trump proposal. There are some procurement reforms at the federal level, some permitting reforms. Well, I'm sure many of you have heard projects take years and years to get federal permits because there are so many agencies involved. The administration wants one agency to be responsible for one decision on a project. And some talk about reducing the size of things like environmental reviews from thousands and thousands of pages to just a much smaller, more concise document. And those are certainly good developments. But for the moment, it's very hard to see this proposal as something that's going to reinvigorate our infrastructure on a national scale. Now, that's all of the Trump infrastructure part of the speech, but I will talk for a few minutes about something that's a little bit more fun, which is the autonomous vehicle revolution and its potential to fix some of the infrastructure problem. Now, we hear in some of it's already real in the Tesla technology, the automatic braking, the collision warning systems that a lot of the luxury car makers are offering to their customers, and Toyota is offering Safety Sense with a lot of these features on every car soon. So is Ford. But will the driverless car revolution make driving more efficient and mean that we need less infrastructure, that if you can fit cars going 80 miles an hour along I-95 and they're only a couple of feet away from each other, then perhaps you don't need to widen the highway? That's something to think about, and we certainly don't know the answer to that yet. But I want to caution you on some of the more utopian talk that we hear about driverless cars. First of all, for people who are driving on a highway, they are going to and from a more dense area. And they may be taking the same route along the highway, but once they get off the highway, they're all going to different places. And so the idea that instead of owning your own car, but you're going to summon this driverless car to your house or to your workplace on demand, and it's going to take you where you're going, that ignores the fact that when people are getting out of work, they have to pick up their kids, or they have to go shopping, or they have to go to the doctor, and they don't want to take their neighbor along on that trip. So once people get off the highway and they diverge into all of these different directions, that's where the driverless car efficiency starts to break down and could actually result in more traffic on local roads as people summon a driverless car to take one kid to ballet and another kid to soccer practice. So you have two cars on the road instead of one, or you send the driverless car to go pick up your food at a takeout store. And so the recent history, and actually longer history of technology, is that whenever something becomes easier and cheaper, like summoning a car, we do more of it. And so that's true of electricity. We use more electricity today than we ever have. We've made it more efficient, but our phones, computers, and so forth consume more of this resource. So without vastly different policy approaches to driving in general, pricing what it costs to drive on the road and cause traffic and so forth, the risk is that autonomous cars are not shared and they result in more traffic, not less traffic, which undoes a lot of the efficiencies that this technology is supposed to usher in. So for the moment, when you hear ideas like we won't need to invest in legacy subway systems in New York, Boston, Washington, San Francisco, because driverless cars can replace these assets. That is very, very far away, if it exists at all. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions, comments, and so forth.
Okay, we have a few questions on Slido, and we'll open it up for questions from the floor as well. I would just sum up by saying the Slido questions showed no appetite for infrastructure. No one said, great, we need more buildings or bridges and roads and plumbing, repair the crumbling infrastructure that we hear so much about. I'm wondering, this seemed to be more of an issue during the election a couple of years ago. Is it an emotional issue after we had a bridge collapse? Is it an economic issue when the economy's not doing well? And we lost interest in this. It just doesn't seem to be something that, I mean, right now people don't seem to be concerned about it. Is it are you sensing that, or is that just my own assessment?
No, I think that's true. I think when we see something like a major hurricane, when you remember the dam in Houston was overtopped and flooded several low-lying neighborhoods last year, then people talk about why didn't the Army Corps of Engineers invest money into protecting more of the city from these events. Remember, these dams that protected the older parts of Houston, they were built 75 years ago, and as the population has quadrupled over the past half century, the federal government and the city and the county have not kept up with flood control infrastructure. So those types of things, I don't think people think about them every day, but they do think about them when something happens and they're wondering if their neighborhood could be flooded. Same thing with the levees in New Orleans after Katrina. That lack of federal, state, and local maintenance helped make those levees not work under conditions that they were designed to work under during Hurricane Katrina. And so instead of spending a few $1 billion on building and maintaining these levees, we ended up spending tens of billions of dollars in rebuilding homes, buildings, and so forth. And I also think the highest dollar infrastructure needs are in the denser coastal states. And so it's much easier to build and maintain a road in a place where fewer people are living, land is cheaper, you can work all hours of the night because it's not as dense as a major city. All of these things become more expensive in a big city, and cities whose infrastructure was built 100 years ago, in the case of the New York subways, these cities have tens of billions of dollars worth of maintenance, reconstruction, modernization needs that places where the population has only grown over the past 40, 50 years, they don't have those same needs. They're more building new infrastructure for new population, although as these places age, they will have some of the same maintenance and repair issues that the older cities see. And places like Las Vegas, Arizona, they also have big irrigation, water system creation and maintenance needs.
Let me follow that up with another question here, or I guess I'll reword it if you're following the slide, more to the rural sense. If we didn't have government assistance to pay for things like broadband or highway in rural areas, how would we get this? Would we have two Americas essentially, one that's disconnected from the urban areas, or is that something that other alternatives, private sector would pick up?
Yeah, I think there's some places where the population is so sparse that it's not economical to build out a broadband system. And the government can deal with that and has dealt with that by putting a surcharge on everybody else's broadband bill to help the telecoms companies build out the rural network. Same with rural airports. I mean, if it's not economical to have an airline come to your airport, everybody else pays for this through the air traffic control system to subsidize flights to lesser served airports. And there's nothing particularly wrong with that, but it's more of the funding is through the private sector, where it's more of a surcharge on the private provision of services than a direct tax.
Okay, so those alternative funding mechanisms you think are workable and that can solve that problem?
Yeah, it's not a great burden on urban constituents to pay extra couple dollars on their broadband bill and build out a rural system, same as people pay for the 911 surcharge, although states have diverted that money to other purposes over the years.
Okay, let me combine two questions, one here from Slido, and we'll open it up for live questions, but there's a sense of the last program, I think we're sort of conflating infrastructure with stimulus program. The last program didn't seem to work. It talked about a lot of shovel-ready jobs, and the jobs didn't seem to be shovel-ready, and we already rebuilt the infrastructure once. Why do we need to rebuild it again? And then there's a related question. If the economy is doing better now, do we need infrastructure from a stimulus standpoint? Because the talk about infrastructure is not just about rebuilding the roads per se. Some talk about it in terms of, creating jobs and all the economic effects. So how does that today, can you make the argument that the whole infrastructure discussion a couple of years ago just isn't relevant, maybe we should move away from it, or is that not something we do?
Yeah, I don't think infrastructure should be thought of as economic stimulus, and that was a mistake in the framing of the Obama administration. Former President Obama, back in 2009, when the economy had collapsed over the previous 6 months, with Congress devised an $800 billion stimulus, and it was marketed as a massive infrastructure investment program, but it really wasn't. Of that money, only $40 billion of it went to real traditional infrastructure, and a lot of that was just giving money to states to maintain their existing infrastructure. And so people naturally say, well, didn't we already do this, as you said, and we didn't really see any results from it. And I think Trump may be making the same mistake, that this is, we have to decide, do we want to invest in high-speed rail on the East Coast? Do we want to build a highway extension between Arizona and Las Vegas? I mean, do we want to do some of these bigger cross-border multi-billion-dollar projects? And if so, then that has to be a much bigger federal investment. But as for shovel-ready projects, I think these projects should have a long planning time. They should be built because they're good in terms of supporting private sector job creation over the long term, that if you can get to work more quickly, if you have a more efficient public transportation system so people aren't waiting for 3 and 4 trains to go by in New York, then the private sector is more productive. If there's a recession, I mean, if the best remedy for short-term relief is sending checks to people. I mean, you don't build an infrastructure project to employ 30,000 people and hope that that money trickles down to everybody else.
Okay, questions from the audience?
To what extent do you think the federal government should be involved in infrastructure?
I think the federal government should confine its infrastructure spending to strategic cross-state border projects. So the tunnel between New York and New Jersey, which Amtrak also uses for the Northeast Corridor traffic, and this is a multi-billion-dollar project that the states can't do by themselves, but it affects the eastern seaboard from Virginia up to Massachusetts if suddenly we have a bottleneck there and the trains can't get through. And so that's a project that the federal government should really sponsor. I mean, the same thing with flood protection projects in states where we've got a national flood insurance program. The federal government keeps bailing people out from flooded homes, but never takes a strategic approach to working with these states on here's the infrastructure we're going to build, it's going to work. If you live in this area, you will be protected from a flood. If you don't, then you're living at your own risk. But there's not enough strategic thinking on these multi-billion-dollar, multi-state projects on things like filling in local potholes on local roads or local water systems. I mean, these are mostly projects that local taxpayers should decide on and pay. Now, I mean, there's complications as with everything. I mean, if you have a distressed community, you know, Flint, Michigan, where people can't pay for the water system, it goes into state receivership. The state makes very bad decisions on how to run the water system, and suddenly you have to have federal money going in to fix all of these problems. But for places that have their own tax bases, that property owners can pay for their own water hookups, sewer hookups, all of these types of things, these are local and state decisions.
Okay, so if I would rephrase that to a different way to make sure I understand, what you're saying that if the project has some type of cross-state benefit, so we have to pay I-95 in North Carolina so people can get from New York to Florida.
Yeah.
If it does, we can justify federal role. If it does not, we should leave it to the states, local levels to address.
Yeah.
Okay, next question.
Well, that was a really good talk.
Thank you. I'm glad someone liked it.
And you didn't have a PowerPoint, which is great. Seems to me a lot of the problem is that these projects are really grossly mismanaged. And I'm thinking about Big Dig in Boston. It was budgeted at $5 billion, came in at $15 million, lots of fraud and just incompetence. So do you think there's something we can do differently to manage these big projects so they just don't get out of control?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and I'm glad you brought up the Big Dig, because this was a project where some of you may remember, most of you probably not, Tip O'Neill, when he was most powerful man in Congress during the Reagan administration, brought this money home to Boston to bury the Central Highway that went through the middle of town. Now, the state thought we really did well in getting all of this money out of Washington, but because the costs kept going up and up, it's the state of Massachusetts that ended up paying for most of the costs. And if you drive on the turnpike in Massachusetts, you can be 100 miles away from Boston, but you are paying a higher toll to support the Central Artery project. And that's been a problem on mega projects since then. Very few of them come in on time and on budget. We have a project called East Side Access in New York to bring the Long Island Railroad over to the east side of town. It was supposed to cost $3 billion and be done by 2009. It's now costing $13 billion, and it won't be done until 2022. So I think the federal government should reward states that manage to meet their own budgeting and timeline benchmarks. If you meet these benchmarks, then you get a little more money. If you don't, then some of the money you've already been given is clawed back on a future project, because otherwise the incentive is just the politicians who are already in office. They get this money from the federal government to start a project. They put out all these press releases that say, we finally started this project that people have been asking for 50 years, and they're out of office before the cost overruns and schedule overruns start to happen. And there's a real incentive for them to lowball the budget. I mean, if you talk to transit officials, they are pressured by the political class above them to give out numbers when they really have done no design, no engineering, and it's just a guess, and it's a low guess. And then the public is surprised and upset when the real number turns out to be much higher.